Chapter 5. I drive my dog into a tree. Mrs. O'Leary saw me before I saw her, which was a pretty good trick considering she's the size of a garbage truck. I walked into the arena and a wall of darkness slammed into me. Woof! The next thing I knew, I was flat on the ground with a huge paw on my chest and an oversized Brillo pad tongue licking my face. Ow, I said. Hey girl, good to see you too. Ow! It took a few minutes for Mrs. O'Leary to calm down and get off me. By then I was pretty much drenched in dog drool. She wanted to play fetch, so I picked up a bronze shield and tossed it across the arena. By the way, Mrs. O'Leary is the world's only friendly hellhound. I kind of inherited her when her previous owner died. She lived at camp, but Beckendorf, well, Beckendorf used to take care of her whenever I was gone. He had smelted Mrs. O'Leary's favourite bronze chewing bone. He'd forged her collar with a little smiley face and a crossbones named Tag. Next to me, Beckendorf had been her best friend. Thinking about that made me sad all over again, but I threw the shield a few more times because Mrs. O'Leary insisted. Soon she started barking, a sound slightly louder than an artillery gun, like she needed to go for a walk. The other campers didn't think it was funny when she went to the bathroom in the arena. It had caused more than one unfortunate slip-and-slide accident, so I opened the gates of the arena and she bounded straight towards the woods. I jogged after her, not too concerned that she was getting ahead. Nothing in the woods could threaten Mrs. O'Leary. Even the dragons and giant scorpions ran away when she came close. When I finally tracked her down, she wasn't using the facilities. She was in a familiar clearing where the Council of Cloven Elders had once put Grover on trial. The place didn't look so good. The grass had turned yellow. The 3 topari frones had lost all their leaves. But that's not what surprised me. In the middle of the glade stood the weirdest trio I'd ever seen. Juniper, the tree nymph, Nico D'Angelo, and a very old, very fat satyr. Nico was the only one who didn't seem freaked out by Mrs. O'Leary's appearance. He looked pretty much like I'd seen him in my dream, an aviator's jacket, black jeans and a t-shirt with dancing skeletons on it, like one of those Day of the Dead pictures. His Stygian iron sword hung at his side. He was only 12, but he looked much older and sadder. He nodded when he saw me, and then went back to scratching Mrs. O'Leary's ears. She sniffed his legs like he was the most interesting thing since ribeye steaks. Being the son of Hades, he'd probably been travelling in all sorts of hellhound-friendly places. The old satyr didn't look nearly so happy. Will someone... What is this underworld creature doing in my forest? He waved his arms and trotted on his hooves as if the grass were hot. You there, Percy Jackson, is this your beast? Sorry, Linnaeus, I said. That's your name, right? The satyr rolled his eyes. His fur was dust bunny grey, and a spiderweb grew between his horns. His belly would have made him an invincible bumper car. Well, of course I'm Linnaeus. Don't tell me you've forgotten a member of the council so quickly. Now call off your beast. Woof, Mrs. O'Leary said happily. The old satyr gulped. Make it go away. Juniper, I will not help you under these circumstances. Juniper turned toward me. She was pretty in a dryady way, with her purple gossamer dress and her elfish face, but her eyes were green-tinted with chlorophyll from crying. Percy, she sniffled, I was just asking about Grover. I know something's happened. He wouldn't stay gone this long if he wasn't in trouble. I was hoping that Linnaeus... I told you, the satyr protested. You are better off without that traitor. Juniper stamped her foot. He is not a traitor. He's the bravest satyr ever, and I want to know where he is. Ruff! Linnaeus's knees started knocking. I won't answer questions with this hellhound sniffing my tail. Nico looked like he was trying not to crack up. I'll walk the dog, he volunteered. He whistled and Mrs. O'Leary bounded after him to the far end of the grove. Linnaeus huffed indignantly and brushed the twigs off his shirt. Now, as I was trying to explain, young lady, your boyfriend has not sent any reports since we voted him into exile. You tried to vote him into exile, I corrected. Chiron and Dionysus stopped you. Bah, they are honorary council members. It wasn't a proper vote. I'll tell Dionysus you said that. Linnaeus paled. I only meant... Now see here, Jackson, this is none of your business. Grover's my friend, I said. He wasn't lying to you about Pan's death. I saw it myself. You were just too scared to accept the truth. Linnaeus's lips quivered. No, Grover's a liar and good riddance. We're better off without him. I pointed at the withered thrones. If things are going so well, where are your friends? Looks like your council hasn't been meeting lately. Maron and Silenus, I'm sure they'll be back, he said, but I could hear the panic in his voice. They're just taking some time off to think. It's been a very unsettling year. It's going to get a lot more unsettling, I promised. Linnaeus, we need Grover. There's got to be a way you can find him with your magic. The old satyr's eye twitched. I'm telling you, I've heard nothing. Perhaps he's dead. Juniper choked back a sob. He's not dead, I said. I can feel that much. Empathy links, Linnaeus said disdainfully. Very unreliable. So, ask around, I insisted. Find him. There's a war coming. Grover was preparing the nature spirits. Without my permission, and it's not our war. I grabbed him by the shirt, which seriously wasn't like me, but the stupid old goat was making me mad. Listen, Linnaeus, when Kronos attacks, he's going to have packs of hellhounds. He's going to destroy everything in his path. Mortals, gods, demigods. Do you think he'll let the satyrs go free? You're supposed to be a leader, so lead. Get out there and see what's happening. Find Grover and bring Juniper some news. Now go. I didn't push him very hard, but he was kind of top-heavy. He fell on his furry rump, and then scrambled to his hooves and ran away with his belly jiggling. Grover will never be accepted. He will die an outcast. When he disappeared into the bushes, Juniper wiped her eyes. I'm sorry, Percy. I didn't mean to get you involved. Linnaeus is still a lord of the wild. You don't want to make an enemy of him. No problem, I said. I've got worse enemies than overweight satyrs. Nico walked back to us. Good job, Percy. Judging from the trail of goat pellets, I'd say you shook him up pretty well. I was afraid I knew why Nico was here, but I tried for a smile. Welcome back. Did you come by just to see Juniper? He blushed. No. That was an accident. I kind of dropped into the middle of their conversation. He scared us to death, Juniper said, right out of the shadows. But Nico, you are the son of Hades and all. Are you sure you haven't heard anything about Grover? Nico shifted his weight. Juniper, like I tried to tell you, even if Grover died, he would reincarnate into something else in nature. I can't sense things like that. Only mortal souls. But if you do hear something, she pleaded, putting her hand on his arm. Anything at all. Nico's cheeks got even brighter red. You bet. I'll keep my ears open. We'll find him, Juniper, I promised. Grover's alive, I'm sure. There must be a simple reason why he hasn't contacted us. She nodded glumly. I hate not being able to leave the forest. He could be anywhere, and I'm stuck here waiting. Or if that silly goat has gotten himself hurt. Mrs. O'Leary bounded back over and took an interest in Juniper's dress. Juniper yelped. Oh, no, you don't. I know about dogs and trees. I'm gone. She went poof into green mist. Mrs. O'Leary looked disappointed, but she lumbered off to find another target, leaving Nico and me alone. Nico tapped his sword on the ground. A tiny mound of animal bones erupted from the dirt. They knit themselves together into a skeletal field mouse and scampered off. I was so sorry to hear about Beckendorf. A lump formed in my throat. How did you? I talked to his ghost. Oh, right. I'd never get used to the fact that this 12-year-old kid spent more time talking with the dead than the living. Did he say anything? He doesn't blame you. He figured you'd be beating yourself up and he said you shouldn't. Is he going to try for rebirth? Nico shook his head. He's staying in Elysium. Said he's waiting for someone. Not sure what he meant, but he seems okay with death. It wasn't much comfort, but it was something. I had a vision. You were on Mount Tam, I told Nico. Was that real? He said. I didn't mean to be spying on the Titans, but I was in the neighbourhood. Doing what? Nico tugged at his sword belt. Following a lead on, my family. I nodded. I knew his past was a painful subject. Until 2 years ago, he and his sister, Bianca, had been frozen in time at a place called the Lotus Hotel and Casino. They'd been there for 70 years. Eventually, a mysterious lawyer rescued them and checked them into a boarding school, but Nico had no memories of his life before the casino. He didn't know anything about his mother. He didn't know who the lawyer was or why they'd been frozen in time or allowed to go free. After Bianca died and left Nico alone, he'd been obsessed with finding answers. So, how did it go? I asked. Any luck? No, he murmured, but I may have a new lead soon. What's the lead? Nico chewed his lip. That's not important right now. You know why I'm here. A feeling of dread started to build in my chest. Ever since Nico first proposed his plan for beating Kronos last summer, I'd had nightmares about it. He would show up occasionally and press me for an answer, but I kept putting him off. Nico, I don't know, I said. It seems pretty extreme. You've got Typhon coming in. What, a week? Most of the other Titans are unleashed now and on Kronos' side. Maybe it's time to think extreme. I looked back toward the camp. Even from this distance, I could hear the Ares and Apollo campers fighting again, yelling curses and spouting bad poetry. They're no match for the Titan army, Nico said. You know that. This comes down to you and Luke, and there's only one way you can beat Luke. I remembered the fight on the Princess Andromeda. I'd been hopelessly outmatched. Kronos had almost killed me with a single cut to my arm, and I couldn't even wound him. Riptide had glanced right off his skin. We can give you the same power, Nico urged. You heard the great prophecy, unless you want to have your soul reaped by a cursed blade. I wondered how Nico had heard the prophecy. Probably from some ghost. You can't prevent a prophecy, I said, but you can fight it. Nico had a strange, hungry light in his eyes. You can become invincible. Maybe we should wait. Try to fight without... No, Nico snarled. It has to be now. I stared at him. Hadn't seen his temper flare like that in a long time. You sure you're okay? He took a deep breath. Percy, all I mean, when the fighting starts, we won't be able to make the journey. This is our last chance. I'm sorry if I'm being too pushy, but 2 years ago, my sister gave her life to protect you. I want you to honour that. Do whatever it takes to stay alive and defeat Kronos. I didn't like the idea, and then I thought about Annabeth calling me a coward, and I got angry. Nico had a point. If Kronos attacked New York, the campers would be no match for his forces. I had to do something. Nico's way was dangerous, maybe even deadly, but it might give me a fighting edge. All right, I decided. What do we do first? His cold, creepy smile made me sorry I'd agreed. First, we'll need to retrace Luke's steps. We need to know more about his past, his childhood. I shuddered, thinking about Rachel's picture from my dream, a smiling 9-year-old Luke. Why do we need to know about that? I'll explain when we get there, Nico said. I've already tracked down his mother. She lives in Connecticut. I stared at him. I'd never thought much about Luke's mortal parent. I'd met his dad, Hermes, but his mum. Luke ran away when he was really young, I said. I didn't think his mum was alive. Oh, she's alive. The way he said it made me wonder what was wrong with her. What kind of horrible person could she be? Okay, I said. So how do we get to Connecticut? I can call Blackjack. No, Nico scowled. Pegasi don't like me, and the feeling is mutual. But there's no need for flying. He whistled, and Mrs. O'Leary came loping out of the woods. Your friend here can help. Nico patted her head. You haven't tried shadow travel yet? Shadow travel? Nico whispered in Mrs. O'Leary's ear. She tilted her head, suddenly alert. Hop on board, Nico told me. I'd never considered riding a dog before, but Mrs. O'Leary was certainly big enough. I climbed onto her back and held her collar. This will make her very tired, Nico warned, so you can't do it often, and it works best at night. But all shadows are part of the same substance. There is only one darkness, and creatures of the underworld can use it as a road or a door. I don't understand, I said. No, Nico said. It took me a long time to learn, but Mrs. O'Leary knows. Tell her where to go. Tell her Westport, the home of May Castellan. You're not coming? Don't worry, he said. I'll meet you there. I was a little nervous, but I leaned down to Mrs. O'Leary's ear. Okay, girl, can you take me to Westport, Connecticut? May Castellan's place? Mrs. O'Leary sniffed the air. She looked into the gloom of the forest, and then she bounded forward, straight into an oak tree. Just before we hit, we passed into shadows, as cold as the dark side of the moon. Chapter 6. My cookies get scorched. I don't recommend shadow travel if you're scared of A, the dark, B, cold shivers up your spine, C, strange noises, D, going so fast you feel like your face is peeling off. In other words, I thought it was awesome. 1 minute I couldn't see anything. I could only see and feel Mrs. O'Leary's fear and my fingers wrapped around the bronze links of her dog collar. The next minute the shadows melted into a new scene. We were on a cliff in the woods of Connecticut. At least, it looked like Connecticut from the few times I'd been there. Lots of trees, low stone walls, big houses. Down one side of the cliff, a highway cut through a ravine. Down the other side was someone's backyard. The property was huge, more wilderness than lawn. The house was a 2-story white colonial. Despite the fact that it was right on the other side of the hill from a highway, it felt like it was in the middle of nowhere. I could see a light glowing in the kitchen window. A rusty old swing set stood under an apple tree. I couldn't imagine living in a house like this, with an actual yard and everything. I'd lived in a tiny apartment or a school dorm my whole life. If this was Luke's home, I wondered why he'd ever wanted to leave. Mrs. O'Leary staggered. I remembered what Nico had said about shadow travel draining her, so I slipped off her back. She let out a huge toothy yawn that would have scared a T-Rex, and then turned in a circle and flopped down so hard the ground shook. Nico appeared right next to me, as if the shadows had darkened and created him. He stumbled, but I caught his arm. I'm okay, he managed, rubbing his eyes. How did you do that? Practice. A few times running into walls, a few accidental trips to China. Mrs. O'Leary started snoring. If it hadn't been for the roar of traffic behind us, I'm sure she would have woken up the whole neighbourhood. Are you going to take a nap too? I asked Nico. He shook his head. The first time I shadow travelled, I passed out for a week. Now it just makes me a little drowsy. But I can't do it more than once or twice a night. Mrs. O'Leary won't be going anywhere for a while. So, we've got some quality time in Connecticut. I gazed at the white colonial house. What now? We ring the doorbell, Nico said. If I were Luke's mum, I would not have opened my door at night for 2 strange kids, but I wasn't anything like Luke's mum. I knew that even before we reached the front door. The sidewalk was lined with these little stuffed beanbag animals you see in gift shops. There were miniature lions, pigs, dragons, hydras, even a teeny minotaur in a little minotaur diaper. Judging from their sad shape, the beanbag creatures had been sitting out here a long time, since the snow melted last spring at least. One of the hydras had a tree sapling sprouting between its necks. The front porch was infested with wind chimes. Shiny bits of glass and metal clinked in the breeze. Brass ribbons tinkled like water and made me realise I needed to use the bathroom. I didn't know how Miss Castellan could stand all the news. And the noise. The front door was painted turquoise. The name Castellan was written in English and below in Greek. Nico looked at me. Ready? He'd barely tapped the door when it swung open. Luke! The old lady cried happily. She looked like someone who enjoyed sticking her fingers in electrical sockets. Her white hair stuck out in tufts all over her head. Her pink house dress was covered in scorch marks and smears of ash. When she smiled, her face looked unnaturally stretched, and the high-voltage light in her eyes made me wonder if she was blind. Oh, my dear boy! She hugged Nico. I was trying to figure out why she thought Nico was Luke. They looked absolutely nothing alike. When she smiled at me and said, Luke! She forgot all about Nico and gave me a hug. She smelled like burned cookies. She was as thin as a scarecrow, but that didn't stop her from almost crushing me. Come in, she insisted. I have your lunch ready. She ushered us inside. The living room was even weirder than the front lawn. Mirrors and candles filled every available space. I couldn't look anywhere without seeing my own reflection. Above the mantel, a little bronze Hermes flew around the second hand of a ticking clock. I tried to imagine the god of messengers ever falling in love with this old woman, but the idea was too bizarre. Then I noticed the framed picture on the mantel, and I froze. It was exactly like Rachel's sketch. Luke, around 9 years old, with blonde hair and a big smile and 2 missing teeth. The lack of a scar on his face made him look like a different person, carefree and happy. How could Rachel have known about that picture? This way, my dear. Miss Castellan steered me toward the back of the house. Oh, I told them you would come back. I knew it. She sat us down at the kitchen table. Stacked on the counter were hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of Tupperware boxes with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches inside. The ones on the bottom were green and fuzzy, like they'd been there for a long time. The smell reminded me of my 6th grade locker, and that's not a good thing. On top of the oven was a stack of cookie sheets. Each one had a dozen burned cookies on it. In the sink was a mountain of empty plastic Kool-Aid pitchers. A beanbag Medusa sat by the faucet, like she was guarding the mess. Miss Castellan started humming as she got out peanut butter and jelly and started making a new sandwich. Something was burning in the oven. I got the feeling more cookies were on the way. Above the sink, taped all around the window, were dozens of little pictures, cut from magazines and newspaper ads. Pictures of Hermes from the FTD Flowers logo, and Quickie cleaners. Pictures of the Caducus from medical ads. My heart sank. I wanted to get out of that room, but Miss Castellan kept smiling at me as she made the sandwich, like she was making sure I didn't bolt. Nico coughed. Miss Castellan. We need to ask you about your son. Oh, yes, they told me he would never come back, but I knew better. She patted my cheek affectionately, giving my peanut butter racing stripes. When did you last see him? Nico asked. Her eyes lost focus. He was so young when he left, she said wistfully. 3rd grade. That's too young to run away. He said he'd be back for lunch, and I waited. He likes peanut butter sandwiches and cookies and Kool-Aid. He'll be back for lunch very soon. Then she looked at me and smiled. Why, Luke, there you are. You look so handsome. You have your father's eyes. She turned toward the pictures of Hermes above the sink. Now, there's a good man. Yes, indeed. He comes to visit me, you know. The clock kept ticking in the other room. I wiped the peanut butter off my face and looked at Nico pleadingly, like, can we get out of here now? Mum, Nico said, what happened to your eyes? Her gaze seemed fractured, like she was trying to focus on him through a kaleidoscope. Why, Luke, you know the story. It was right before you were born, wasn't it? I'd always been special, able to see through the... whatever they call it. The mist, I said. Yes, dear, she nodded encouragingly. And they offered me an important job. That's how special I was. I glanced at Nico, but he looked as confused as I was. What sort of job? I asked. What happened? Miss Castellan frowned. Her knife hovered over the sandwich bread. Dear me, it didn't work out, did it? Your father warned me not to try. He said it was too dangerous, but I had to. It was my destiny. And now, I still can't get the images out of my head. They make everything seem so fuzzy. Would you like some cookies? She pulled a tray out of the oven and dumped a dozen lumps of chocolate chip charcoal on the table. Luke was so kind, Miss Castellan murmured. He left to protect me, you know. He said if he went away, the monsters wouldn't threaten me. But I told him the monsters are no threat. They sit outside on the sidewalk all day, and they never come in. She picked up the little stuffed Medusa from the windowsill. Do they, Mrs. Medusa? No, no, fret at all. She beamed at me. I'm so glad you came home. I knew you weren't ashamed of me. I've shifted in my seat. I imagined being Luke sitting at this table, 8 or 9 years old, and just beginning to realise that my mother wasn't all there. Miss Castellan, I said. Mum, she corrected. Yeah. Have you seen Luke since he left home? Well, of course. I didn't know if she was imagining that or not. For all I knew, every time the mailman came to the door, he was Luke, but Nico sat forward expectantly. When? He asked. When did Luke visit you last? Well, it was... Oh, goodness. A shadow passed across her face. The last time, he looked so different. A scar, a terrible scar, and his voice so full of pain. His eyes, I said. Were they gold? Gold, she blinked. No, how silly. Luke has blue eyes, beautiful blue eyes. So Luke really had been here, and this had happened before last summer, before he'd turned into Kronos. Miss Castellan. Nico put his hand on the old woman's arm. This is very important. Did he ask you for anything? She frowned as if trying to remember. My blessing, isn't that sweet? She looked at her son certainly. He was going to a river. He said he needed my blessing. I gave it to him, of course I did. Nico looked at me triumphantly. Thank you, Mum. That's all the information we... Miss Castellan gasped. She doubled over and her cookie tray clattered to the floor. Nico and I jumped to our feet. Miss Castellan, I said. Ah! She straightened. I scrambled away and almost fell over the kitchen table because her eyes were glowing green. My child, she rasped in a much deeper voice. Must protect him. Hermes, help. Not my child. Not his fate. No. She grabbed Nico by the shoulders and began to shake him, as if to make him understand. Not his fate. Nico made a strangled scream and pushed her away. He gripped the hilt of his sword. Percy, we need to get out. Suddenly, Miss Castellan collapsed. I lurched forward and caught her before she hit the edge of the table. I managed to get her into a chair. Miss C, I asked. She muttered something incomprehensible and shook her head. Goodness, I dropped the cookies. How silly of me. She blinked and her eyes went back to normal. Or at least, what they had been before. The green glow was gone. Are you okay? I asked. Well, of course, dear, I'm fine. Why do you ask? I glanced at Nico, who mouthed the word, leave. Miss C, you are telling us something. You were telling us something, I said. Something about your son. Was I? She said dreamily. Yes, his blue eyes. We were talking about his blue eyes. Such a handsome boy. We have to go, Nico said urgently. We'll tell Luke. We'll tell him you said hello. But you can't leave. Miss Castellan got shakily to her feet, and I backed away. I felt silly being scared of a frail old woman, but the way her voice had changed, the way she'd grabbed Nico. Hermes will be here soon, she promised. He'll want to see his boy. Maybe next time, I said. Thank you for I looked down at the burned cookies scattered on the floor. Thanks for everything. She tried to stop us, to offer us Kool-Aid, but I had to get out of that house. On the front porch, she grabbed my wrist, and I almost jumped out of my skin. Luke, at least be safe. Promise me you'll be safe. I will. Mum. That made her smile. She released my wrist, and as she closed the front door, I could hear her talking to the candles. You hear that? He will be safe. I told you he would be. As the door shut, Nico and I ran. The little beanbag animals on the sidewalk seemed to grin at us as we passed. Back at the cliff, Mrs. O'Leary had found a friend. A cosy campfire crackled in a ring of stones. A girl about 8 years old was sitting cross-legged next to Mrs. O'Leary, scratching the hellhound's ears. The girl had mousy brown hair and a simple brown dress. She wore a scarf over her head, so she looked like a pioneer kid, like the ghost of Little House on the Prairie or something. She poked the fire with a stick, and it seemed to glow more richly red than a normal fire. Hello, she said. My first thought was, monster. When you're a demigod and you find a sweet little girl alone in the woods, that's typically a good time to draw your sword and attack. Plus, the encounter with Miss Castellan had rattled me pretty bad. But Nico bowed to the little girl. Hello again, lady. She studied me with eyes as red as the firelight. I decided it was safest to bow. Sit, Percy Jackson, she said. Would you like some dinner? After staring at mouldy peanut butter sandwiches and burned cookies, I didn't have much of an appetite, but the girl waved her hand and a picnic appeared at the edge of the fire. There were plates of roast beef, baked potatoes, buttered carrots, fresh bread, and a whole bunch of other foods. I hadn't had it in a long time. My stomach started to rumble. It was the kind of home-cooked meal people are supposed to have but never do. The girl made a 5-foot-long dog biscuit appear for Mrs. O'Leary, who happily began tearing it to shreds. I sat next to Nico. We picked up our food, and I was about to dig in when I thought better of it. I scraped part of my meal into the flames, the way we do at camp. For the gods, I said. The little girl smiled. Thank you. As tender of the flame, I get a share of every sacrifice, you know. I recognise you now, I said. The first time I came to camp, you were sitting by the fire, in the middle of the commons area. You did not stop to talk, the girl recalled sadly. Alas, most never do. Nico talked to me. He was the first in many years. Everyone rushes about. No time for visiting family. You're Hestia, I said. Goddess of the hearth. She nodded. Okay, so she looked 8 years old. I didn't ask. I'd learned that gods could look any way they pleased. My lady, Nico asked, why aren't you with the other Olympians, fighting Typhon? I'm not much for fighting. Her red eyes flickered. I realised they weren't just reflecting the flames, they were filled with flames, but not like Ares' eyes. Hestia's eyes were warm and cosy. Besides, she said, someone has to keep the home fires burning while the other gods are away. So you're guarding Mount Olympus, I asked. Guard may be too strong a word, but if you ever need a warm place to sit and a home-cooked meal, you are welcome to visit. Now eat. My plate was empty before I knew it. Nico scarfed his down just as fast. That was great, I said. Thank you, Hestia. She nodded. Did you have a good visit with May Castellan? For a moment I'd almost forgotten the old lady with her bright eyes and her maniacal smile, the way she'd suddenly seemed possessed. What's wrong with her, exactly? I asked. She was born with a gift, Hestia said. She could see through the mist. Like my mother, I said. And I was also thinking, like Rachel. But the glowing eyes thing. Some bear the curse of sight better than others, the goddess said sadly. For a while, May Castellan had many talents. She attracted the attention of Hermes himself. They had a beautiful baby boy. For a brief time, she was happy. And then she went too far. I remembered what Miss Castellan had said. They offered me an important job. It didn't work out. I wondered what kind of job left you like that. 1 minute she was all happy, I said. And then she was freaking out about her son's fate, like she knew he'd turned into Kronos. What happened to divide her like that? The goddess's face darkened. That is a story I do not like to tell, but May Castellan saw too much. If you are to understand your enemy Luke, you must understand his family. I thought about the sad little pictures of Hermes taped above May Castellan's sink. I wondered if Miss Castellan had been so crazy when Luke was little. That green-eyed fit could have seriously scared a 9-year-old kid. And if Hermes never visited, if he'd left Luke alone with his mum all those years. No wonder Luke ran away, I said. I mean, it wasn't right to leave his mum like that, but still, he was just a kid. Hermes shouldn't have abandoned them. Hestia scratched behind Mrs. O'Leary's ears. The hellhound wagged her tail and accidentally knocked over a tree. It isn't to judge others, Hestia warned, but will you follow Luke's path? Seek the same powers? Nico set down his plate. We have no choice, my lady. It's the only way Percy stands a chance. Hestia opened her hand and the fire roared. Flames shot 30 feet into the air. Heat slapped me in the face. Then the fire died back down to normal. Not all powers are spectacular. Hestia looked at me. Sometimes the hardest power to master is the power of yielding. Do you believe me? Uh-huh, I said. Anything to keep her from messing with her flame powers again. The goddess smiled. You are a good hero, Percy Jackson. Not too proud, I like that. But you have much to learn. When Dionysus was made a god, I gave up my throne for him. It was the only way to avoid a civil war among the gods. It's unbalanced the council, I remembered. Suddenly, there were 7 guys and 5 girls. Hestia shrugged. It was the best solution. Not a perfect one. Now I tend the fire. I fade slowly into the background. No one will ever write epic poems about the deeds of Hestia. Most demigods don't even stop to talk to me. But that is no matter. I keep the peace. I yield when necessary. Can you do this? I don't know what you mean. She studied me. Perhaps not yet, but soon. Will you continue your quest? Is that why you're here? To warn me against going? Hestia shook her head. I'm here because when all else fails, when all the other mighty gods have gone off to war, I am all that's left. Home. Hearth. I am the last Olympian. You must remember me when you face your final decision. I didn't like the way she said final. I looked at Nico and then back at Hestia's warm, glowing eyes. I have to continue, my lady. I have to stop Luke. I mean Kronos. Hestia nodded. Very well. I cannot be of much assistance, beyond what I have already told you. But since you sacrificed to me, I can return you to your own hearth. I will see you again, Percy, on Olympus. Her tone was ominous, as though our next meeting would not be happy. The goddess waved her hand, and everything faded. Suddenly I was home. Nico and I were sitting on the couch in my mum's apartment on the Upper East Side. That was the good news. The bad news was that the rest of the living room was occupied by Mrs. O'Leary. I heard a muffled yell from the bedroom. Paul's voice said, Who put this wall of fur in the doorway? Percy, my mum called out. Are you here? Are you all right? I'm here, I shouted back. Woof! Mrs. O'Leary tried to turn in a circle to find my mum, knocking all the pictures off the walls. She's only met my mum once before, long story, but she loves her. It took a few minutes, but we finally got things worked out. After destroying most of the furniture in the living room and probably making our neighbours really mad, we got my parents out of the bedroom and into the kitchen, where we sat around the kitchen table. Mrs. O'Leary still took up the entire living room, but she settled her head in the kitchen doorway so she could see us, which made her happy. My mum tossed her a 10-pound family-sized tube of ground beef, which disappeared down her gullet. Paul poured lemonade for the rest of us while I explained about our visit to Connecticut. So it's true. Paul stared at me like he'd never seen me before. He was wearing his white bathrobe, now covered in hellhound fur, and his salt and pepper hair was sticking up in every direction. All the talk about monsters and being a demigod. It's really true. I nodded. Last fall I'd explained to Paul who I was. My mum had backed me up, but until this moment, I don't think he really believed us. Sorry about Mrs. O'Leary, I said, destroying the living room and all. Paul laughed like he was delighted. Are you kidding? This is awesome. I mean, when I saw the hoof prints on the Prius, I thought maybe, but this. He patted Mrs. O'Leary's snout. The living room shook. Boom, 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 which either meant a SWAT team was breaking down the door or Mrs. O'Leary was wagging her tail. I couldn't help but smile. Paul was a pretty cool guy, even if he was my English teacher as well as my stepdad. Thanks for not freaking out, I said. Oh, I'm freaking out, he promised, his eyes wide. I just think it's awesome. Yeah, well, I said, you may not be so excited when you hear what's happening. I told Paul and my mum about Typhon and the gods and the battle that was sure to come, and then I told them Nico's plan. My mum laced her fingers around her lemonade glass. She was wearing her old blue flannel bathrobe, and her hair was tied back. Recently she'd started wearing a novel, like she'd wanted to do for years. She'd been writing a novel. I could tell she'd been working on it late into the night because the circles under her eyes were darker than usual. Behind her at the kitchen window, silvery moonlace glowed in the flower box. I'd brought the magical plant back from Calypso's island last summer, and it bloomed like crazy under my mother's care. The scent always calmed me down, but it also made me sad because it reminded me of lost friends. My mum took a deep breath, like she was thinking how to tell me no. Percy, it's dangerous, she said. Even for you. Mum, I know, I could die. Nico explained that, but if we don't try, we'll all die, Nico said. He hadn't touched his lemonade. Miss Jackson, we don't stand a chance against an invasion, and there will be an invasion. An invasion of New York, Paul said. Is that even possible? How could we not see the monsters? He said the word like he still couldn't believe this was real. I don't know, I admitted. I don't see how Kronos could just march into Manhattan, put the mist. Well, the mist is strong. Typhon is trampling across the country right now, and mortals think he's a storm system. Miss Jackson, Nico said, Percy needs your blessing. The process has to start that way. I wasn't sure until we met Luke's mum, but now I'm positive. This has only been done successfully twice before. Both times the mother had to give her blessing. She had to be willing to let her son take the risk. You want me to bless this? She shook her head. It's crazy. Percy, please. Mum, I can't do it without you. And if you survive this process, then I go to war, I said. Me against Kronos, and only one of us will survive. I didn't tell her the whole prophecy about the soul reaping and the end of my days. She didn't need to know that I was probably doomed. I could only hope I'd stop Kronos and save the rest of the world before I died. You're my son, she said miserably. I can't just... I could tell I'd have to push her harder if I wanted her to agree, but I didn't want to. I remembered poor Miss Castellan in her kitchen, waiting for her son to come home, and I realised how lucky I was. My mum had always been there for me, always tried to make things normal for me, even with the gods and monsters and stuff. She put up with me going off on adventures, but now I was asking her blessing to do something that would probably get me killed. I locked eyes with Paul, and some kind of understanding passed between us. Sally, he put his hand over my mother's hands. I can't claim to know what you and Percy have been going through all these years, but it sounds like Percy is doing something noble. I wish I had that much courage. I got a lump in my throat. I didn't get compliments like that too much. My mum stared at her lemonade. She looked like she was trying not to cry. I thought about what Hestia had said, about how hard it is to yield, and I figured maybe my mum was finding that out. Percy, she said, I give you my blessing. I didn't feel any different. No magic glow lit the kitchen or anything. I glanced at Nico. He looked more anxious than ever, but he nodded. It's time. Percy, my mum said, one last thing. If you survive this fight with Kronos, send me a sign. She rummaged through her purse and handed me her cell phone. "Mum," I said, "you know demigods and phones." "I know," she said, "but just in case, if you're not able to call, maybe a sign that I could see from anywhere in Manhattan to let me know you're okay." "Like Theseus," Paul suggested. "He was supposed to raise white sails when he came back home to Athens." "Except he forgot," Nico muttered, and his father jumped off the palace roof in despair. "But other than that, it was a great idea." "What about a flag or a flare?" my mum said. "From Olympus, the Empire State Building." "Something blue," I said. We'd had a running joke for years about blue food. It was my favourite colour, and my mum went out of her way to humour me. Every year my birthday cake, my Easter basket, my Christmas candy canes always had to be blue. "Yes," my mum agreed, "I'll watch for a blue signal, and I'll try to avoid jumping off palace roofs." She gave me one last hug. I tried not to feel like I was saying goodbye. I shook hands with Paul, then Nico, and I walked to the kitchen doorway and looked at Mrs. O'Leary. "Sorry, girl," I said. "Shadow travel time again." She whimpered and crossed her paws over her snout. "Where now?" I asked Nico. "Los Angeles?" "No need," he said. "There's a closer entrance to the underworld." Chapter 7. My math teacher gives me a lift. We emerged in Central Park, just north of the pond. Mrs. O'Leary looked pretty tired as she limped over to a cluster of boulders. She started sniffing around, and I was afraid she might mark her territory, but Nico said, "It's okay, she just smells the way home." I frowned. "Through the rocks?" "The underworld has two major entrances," Nico said. "You know the one in LA? Karen's Ferry." Nico nodded. "Most souls go that way, but there's a smaller path, harder to find. The Door of Orpheus." "The dude with the harp." "Dude with the lyre," Nico corrected. "But yeah, him. He used his music to charm the earth and open a new path into the underworld. He sang his way right into Hades' palace and almost got away with his wife's soul." I remembered the story. Orpheus wasn't supposed to look behind him when he was leading his wife back to the world, but of course he did. It was one of those typical "and so they died, the end" stories that always made us demigods feel warm and fuzzy. "So, this is the Door of Orpheus." I tried to be impressed, but it still looked like a pile of rocks to me. "How does it open?" "We need music," Nico said. "How's your singing?" No. Can't you just, tell it to open? You're the son of Hades and all." "It's not so easy. We need music." I was pretty sure if I tried to sing, all I would cause was an avalanche. "I have a better idea." I turned and called, "Grover!" We waited for a long time. Mrs. O'Leary curled up and took a nap. I could hear the crickets in the woods and an owl hooting. Traffic hummed along Central Park West. Horse hooves clopped down a nearby path, maybe a mounted police patrol. I was sure they'd love to find two kids hanging out in the park at 1 a.m. "It's no good," Nico said at last. But I had a feeling. My empathy link was really tingling for the first time in months, which either meant a whole lot of people had suddenly switched on the nature channel or Grover was close. I shut my eyes and concentrated. Grover. I knew he was somewhere in the park. Why couldn't I sense his emotions? All I got was a faint hum in the base of my skull. "Grover." I thought more insistently. Something said. An image came into my head. I saw a giant elm tree deep in the woods, well off the main paths. Gnarled roots laced the ground, making a kind of bed. Lying on it, with his arms crossed and his eyes closed, was a satyr. At first I couldn't be sure it was Grover. He was covered in twigs and leaves, like he'd been sleeping there a long time. The roots seemed to be shaping themselves around him, slowly pulling him into the earth. "Grover," I said, "wake up." "Dude, you're covered in dirt, wake up." "Sleepy," his mind murmured. "Food," I suggested. "Pancakes." His eyes shot open. A blur of thoughts filled my head like he was suddenly on fast forward. The image shattered, and I almost fell over. "What happened?" Nico asked. "I got through. He's on his way." A minute later, the tree next to us shivered. Grover fell out of the branches, right on his head. "Grover!" I yelled. "Woof!" Mrs. O'Leary looked up, probably wondering if we were going to play fetch with the satyr. "Blah, blah," Grover bleated. "You okay, man?" "Oh, I'm fine," he rubbed his head. His horns had grown so much they poked an inch above his curly hair. "I was at the other end of the park. The dryads had this great idea of passing me through the trees to get me here. They don't understand height very well." He grinned and got to his feet. Well, his hooves, actually. Since last summer, Grover had stopped trying to disguise himself as human. He never wore a cap or fake feet anymore. He didn't even wear jeans, since he had furry goat legs from the waist down. His t-shirt had a picture from that book, Where the Wild Things Are. It was covered with dirt and tree sap. His goatee looked fuller, almost manly. Or goatly. And he was as tall as me now. "Good to see you, G-Man," I said. "You remember Nico?" Grover nodded at Nico, and then he gave me a big hug. He smelled like fresh mown lawns. "Percy," he bleated. "I missed you. I miss camp. They don't serve very good enchiladas in the wilderness." I was worried. I said. "Where have you been the last 2 months?" "The last two?" Grover's smile faded. "The last 2 months? What are you talking about?" "We haven't heard from you," I said. "Juniper's worried. We sent Iris messages, but—" "Hold on." He looked up at the stars like he was trying to calculate his position. "What month is this?" "August." The colour drained from his face. "That's impossible. It's June. I just laid down to take a nap and—" He grabbed my arms. "I remember now. He knocked me out. Percy, we have to stop him." "Whoa," I said. "Slow down. Tell me what happened." He took a deep breath. I was walking in the woods up by Harlem Mere, and I felt this tremble in the ground like something powerful was near." "You can sense stuff like that?" Nico asked. Grover nodded. "Since Pan's death, I can feel when something is wrong in nature. It's like my ears and eyes are sharper when I'm in the wild. Anyway, I started following the scent. This man in a long black coat was walking through the park, and I noticed he didn't cast a shadow. Middle of a sunny day, and he cast no shadow. He kind of shimmered as he moved." "Like a mirage?" Nico asked. "Yes," Grover said, "and whenever he passed humans, the humans would pass out," Nico said, "curl up and go to sleep." "That's right. Then after he was gone, they'd get up and go about their business like nothing happened." I stared at Nico. "You know this guy in black?" "Afraid so," Nico said. "Grover, what happened?" "I followed the guy. He kept looking up at the buildings around the park like he was making estimates or something. This lady jogger ran by, and she curled up on the sidewalk and started snoring. The guy in black put his hand on her forehead, like he was checking her temperature. Then he kept walking. By this time I knew he was a monster or something even worse. I followed him into this grove, to the base of a big elm tree. I was about to summon some dryads to help me capture him, when he turned and—" Grover swallowed. "Percy, his face. I couldn't make out his face because it kept shifting. Just looking at him made me sleepy," I said. What are you doing?" he said. "Just having a look around. You should always scout a battlefield before the battle." I said something really smart like, "This forest is under my protection. You won't start any battles here." And he laughed. He said, "You're lucky I'm saving my energy for the main event, little satyr. I'll just grant you a short nap. Pleasant dreams." And that's the last thing I remember. Nico exhaled. "Grover, you met Morpheus, the god of dreams. You're lucky you ever woke up." 2 months, Grover moaned. "He put me to sleep for 2 months. I tried to wrap my mind around what this meant. Now it made sense why we hadn't been able to contact Grover all this time. "Why didn't the nymphs try to wake you?" I asked. Grover shrugged. "Most nymphs aren't good with time. 2 months for a tree, that's nothing. They probably didn't think anything was wrong." "We've got to figure out what Morpheus was doing in the park," I said. "I don't like this main event thing he mentioned." "He's working for Kronos," Nico said. "We know that already. A lot of the minor gods are. This just proves there's going to be an invasion. Percy, we have to get on with our plan." "Wait," Grover said. "What plan?" We told him, and Grover started tugging at his leg fur. "You're not serious," he said. "Not the underworld again?" "I'm not asking you to come, man," I promised. "I know you just woke up, but we need some music to open the door. Can you do it?" Grover took out his reed pipes. "I guess I could try. I know a few Nirvana tunes that can split rocks, but Percy, are you sure you want to do this?" "Please, man," I said. "It would mean a lot, for old time's sake." He whimpered. "As I recall, in the old times we almost died a lot, but okay, here goes nothing." He put his pipes to his lips and played a shrill, lively tune. The boulders trembled. A few more stanzas and they cracked open, revealing a triangular crevice. I peered inside. Steps led down into the darkness. The air smelled of mildew and death. It brought back bad memories of my trip through the labyrinth last year, but this tunnel felt even more dangerous. It led straight to the land of Hades, and that was almost always a one-way trip. I turned to Grover. "Thanks. I think." "Percy, is Kronos really going to invade?" "I wish I could tell you better, but yeah, he will." I thought Grover might chew his reed pipes in anxiety, but he straightened up and brushed off his t-shirt. I couldn't help thinking how different he looked from fat old Linnaeus. "I've got to rally the nature spirits then. Maybe we can help. I'll see if we can find this Morpheus." "Better tell Juniper you're okay, too." His eyes widened. "Juniper? Oh, she's going to kill me." He started to run off and then scrambled back and gave me another hug. "Be careful down there. Come back alive." Once he was gone, Nico and I roused Mrs. O'Leary from her nap. When she smelled the tunnel, she got excited and led the way down the steps. It was a pretty tight fit. I hoped she wouldn't get stuck. I couldn't imagine how much Drano we'd need to unstick a hellhound wedged halfway down a tunnel to the underworld. "Ready?" Nico asked me. "It'll be fine, don't worry." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself. I glanced up at the stars, wondering if I would ever see them again. And then we plunged into darkness. The stairs went on forever, narrow, deep and slippery. It was completely dark except for the light of my sword. I tried to go slow, but Mrs. O'Leary had other ideas. She bounded ahead, barking happily. The sound echoed through the tunnel like cannon shots, and I figured we would not be catching anybody by surprise once we reached the bottom. Nico lagged behind, which I thought was strange. "You okay?" I asked him. "Fine." What was that expression on his face? Doubt? "Just keep moving," he said. I didn't have much choice. I followed Mrs. O'Leary into the depths. After another hour, I started to hear the roar of a river. We emerged to the base of a cliff, on a plain of black volcanic sand. To our right, the river Styx gushed from the rocks and roared off in a cascade of rapids. To our left, far away in the gloom, fires burned on the ramparts of Erebos, the great black walls of Hades' kingdom. I shuddered. I'd first been here when I was 12, and only Annabeth and Grover's company had given me the courage to keep going. Nico wasn't going to be quite as helpful with the courage thing. He looked pale and worried himself. Only Mrs. O'Leary acted happy. She ran along the beach, picked up a random human leg bone, and romped back toward me. She dropped the bone at my feet and waited for me to throw it. Maybe later, girl." I stared at the dark waters, trying to get up my nerve. "So, Nico, how do we do this?" "We have to go inside the gates first," he said. "But the river's right here." "I have to get something," he said. "It's the only way." He marched off without waiting. I frowned. Nico hadn't mentioned anything about going inside the gates, but now that we were here, I didn't know what else to do. Reluctantly, I followed him down the beach toward the big black gates. Lines of the dead stood outside waiting to get in. It must have been a heavy day for funerals because even the AZ Death line was backed up. "Woof," Mrs. O'Leary said. Before I could stop her, she bounded toward the security checkpoint. Cerberus, the guard dog of Hades, appeared out of the gloom. A three-headed Rottweiler so big he made Mrs. O'Leary look like a toy poodle. Cerberus was half transparent, so he's really hard to see until he's close enough to kill you, but he acted like he didn't care about us. He was too busy saying hello to Mrs. O'Leary. "Mrs. O'Leary, no," I shouted at her. "Don't sniff." "Oh, man." Nico smiled, and then he looked at me and his expression turned all serious again, like he'd remembered something unpleasant. "Come on. They won't give us any trouble in the line. You're with me." I didn't like it, but we slipped through the security ghouls and into the fields of asphodel. I had to whistle for Mrs. O'Leary 3 times before she left Cerberus alone and ran after us. We hiked over black fields of grass dotted with black poplar trees. If I really died in a few days, like the prophecy said, I might end up here forever, but I tried not to think about that. Nico trudged ahead, bringing us closer and closer to the palace of Hades. "Hey," I said, "we're inside the gates already. Where are we?" Mrs. O'Leary growled. A shadow appeared overhead, something dark, cold, and stinking of death. It swooped down and landed in the top of a poplar tree. Unfortunately, I recognised her. She had a shriveled face, a horrible blue knit hat, and a crumpled velvet dress. Leathery bat wings sprang from her back. Her feet had sharp talons, and in her brass, clawed hands she held a flaming whip and a paisley handbag. "Mrs. Dodds," I said. She bared her fangs. "Welcome back, honey." Her 2 sisters, the other Furies, swooped down and settled next to her in the branches of the poplar. "You know Electo?" Nico asked me. "If you mean the hag in the middle, yeah," I said. "She was my math teacher." Nico nodded like this didn't surprise him. He looked up at the Furies and took a deep breath. "I've done what my father asked. Take us to the palace." I tensed. "Wait a second, Nico. What do you—" "I'm afraid this is my new lead, Percy. My father promised me information about my family, but he wants to see you before we try the river. I'm sorry." "You tricked me." I was so mad I couldn't think. I lunged at him, but the Furies were fast. 2 of them swooped down and plucked me up in their arms. My sword fell out of my hand, and before I knew it, I was dangling 60 feet in the air. "Oh, don't struggle, honey," my old math teacher cackled in my ear. "I'd hate to drop you." Mrs. O'Leary barked angrily and jumped, trying to reach me, but we were too high. "Tell Mrs. O'Leary to behave," Nico warned. He was hovering near me in the clutches of the 3rd Fury. "I don't want her to get hurt. Percy, my father is waiting. He just wants to talk." I wanted to tell Mrs. O'Leary to attack Nico, but it wouldn't have done any good. And Nico was right about one thing. My dog would get hurt if she tried to pick a fight with the Furies. I gritted my teeth. "Mrs. O'Leary, down. It's okay, girl." She whimpered and turned in circles, looking at me. "All right, traitor," I growled at Nico. "You've got your prize. Take me to the stupid palace." Electro dropped me like a sack of turnips in the middle of the palace garden. It was beautiful in a creepy way. Skeletal white trees grew from marble basins. Flower beds overflowed with golden plants and gemstones. A pair of thrones, 1 bone and 1 silver, sat on the balcony with a few of the fields of asphodel. It would have been a nice place to spend a Saturday morning, except for the sulphurous smell and the cries of tortured souls in the distance. Skeletal warriors guarded the only exit. They wore tattered US Army desert combat fatigues and carried M16s. The third Fury deposited Nico next to me. Then all three of them settled on the top of the skeletal throne. I resisted the urge to strangle Nico. They'd only stop me. I'd have to wait for my revenge. I stared at the empty thrones, waiting for something to happen. Then the air shimmered. 3 figures appeared, Hades and Persephone on their thrones, and an older woman standing between them. They seemed to be in the middle of an argument. "You told you he was a bum," the older woman said. "Mother," Persephone replied. "We have visitors," Hades barked. "Please." Hades, one of my least favourite gods, smoothed his black robes, which were covered with the terrified faces of the damned. He had pale skin and the intense eyes of a madman. "Percy Jackson," he said with satisfaction. "At last." Queen Persephone studied me curiously. I'd seen her once before in the winter, but now in the summer she looked like a totally different goddess. She had lustrous black hair and warm brown eyes. Her dress shimmered with colours. Flower patterns in the fabric changed and bloomed, roses, tulips, honeysuckle. The woman standing between them was obviously Persephone's mother. She had the same hair and eyes, but looked older and sterner. Her dress was golden, the colour of a wheat field. Her hair was woven with dried grasses, so it reminded me of a wicker basket. I figured if somebody lit a match next to her, she'd be in serious trouble. The older woman said. "Demigods, just what we need." Next to me, Nico knelt. I wished I had my sword so I could cut his stupid head off. Unfortunately, Riptide was still out in the field somewhere. "Father," Nico said, "I've done as you asked." "Took you long enough," Hades grumbled. "Your sister would have done a better job." Nico lowered his head. If I hadn't been so mad at the little creep, I might have felt sorry for him. I glared up at the god of the dead. "What do you want, Hades?" "To talk, of course." The god twisted his mouth in a cruel smile. "Didn't Nico tell you?" "So this whole quest was a lie? Nico brought me down here to get me killed?" "Oh no," Hades said. "I'm afraid Nico was quite sincere about wanting to help you. The boy is as honest as he is dense. I simply convinced him to take a small detour and bring you here first." "Father," Nico said, "you promised that Percy would not be harmed. You said if I brought him, you would tell me about my past, about my mother." Queen Persephone sighed dramatically. "Can we please not talk about that woman in my presence?" "I'm sorry, my dove," Hades said. "I had to promise the boy something." The older lady harumphed. "I warned you, daughter. This scoundrel Hades is no good. You could have married the god of doctors or the god of lawyers, but no, you had to eat the pomegranate. Mother, and get stuck in the underworld. Mother, please. And here it is in August. And do you come home like you're supposed to? Do you ever think about your poor lonely mother?" "Demeter," Hades shouted, "that is enough. You are a guest in my house." "Oh, a house is it?" she said. "You call this dump a house? Make my daughter live in this dark, damp. "I told you," Hades said, grinding his teeth. "There's a war in the world above. You and Persephone are better off here with me." "Excuse me," I broke in, "but if you're going to kill me, could you just get on with it?" All 3 gods looked at me. "Well, this one has an attitude," Demeter observed. "Indeed," Hades agreed. "I'd love to kill him." "Father," Nico said, "you promised." "Husband, we talked about this," Persephone chided. "You can't go around incinerating every hero. Besides, he's brave. I like that." Hades rolled his eyes. "You liked that Orpheus fellow too. Look how well that turned out. Let me kill him just a little bit." "Father, you promised," Nico said. "You said you only wanted to talk to him. You said if I brought him, you'd explain." Hades glowered, smoothing the folds of his robes. "And so I shall. Your mother, what can I tell you? She was a wonderful woman." He glanced uncomfortably at Persephone. "Forgive me, my dear, I mean for a mortal, of course. Her name was Maria de Angelo. She was from Venice. Her father was a diplomat in Washington, D.C. That's where I met her. When you and your sister were young, it was a bad time to be children of Hades. World War II was brewing. A few of my other children were leading the losing side. I thought it best to put you two out of harm's way." "That's why you hid us in the Lotus Casino." Hades shrugged. "You didn't age. You didn't realize time was passing. I waited for the right time to bring you out." "But what happened to our mother? Why didn't I remember her?" "Not important," Hades snapped. "What? Of course it's important. And you had other children. Why were we the only ones who were sent away? And who was the lawyer who got us out?" Hades grit his teeth. "You should do well to listen more and talk less, boy. As for the lawyer..." Hades snapped his fingers. On top of his throne, the Fury Electo began to change until she was a middle-aged man in a pinstripe suit with a briefcase. He looked strange, crouching at Hades' shoulder. "You," Nico said. The Fury cackled. "I do lawyers and teachers very well." Nico was trembling. "But why did you free us from the casino?" "You know why," Hades said. "This idiot son of Poseidon cannot be allowed to be the child of the prophecy." I plucked a ruby off the nearest plant and threw it at Hades. It sank harmlessly into his robe. You should be helping Olympus, I said. All the other gods are fighting Typhon, and you're just sitting here. Waiting things out, Hades finished. Yes, that's correct. When's the last time Olympus ever helped me, half-blood? When's the last time a child of mine was ever welcomed as a hero? Bah! Why should I rush out and help them? I'll stay here with my forces intact. And when Kronos comes after you? Let him try. He'll be weakened, and my son here, Nico. Hades looked at him with distaste. Well, he's not much now, I'll grant you. It would have been better if Bianca had lived. But give him 4 more years of training. We can hold out that long, surely. Nico will turn 16, as the prophecy says, and then he will make the decision that will save the world, and I will be the king of the gods. You're crazy, I said. Kronos will crush you right after he finishes pulverizing Olympus. Hades spread his hands. Well, you'll get a chance to find out, half-blood, because you'll be waiting out this war in my dungeons. No, Nico said. Father, this wasn't our agreement, and you haven't told me everything. I've told you all you need to know, Hades said. As for our agreement, I spoke with Jackson. I did not harm him. You got your information. If you had wanted a better deal, you should have made me swear on the sticks. Now go to your room. He waved his hand and Nico vanished. That boy needs to eat more, Demeter grumbled. He's too skinny. He needs more cereal. Persephone rolled her eyes. Mother, enough with the cereal. My lord Hades, are you sure we can't let this little hero go? He's awfully brave. No, my dear, I've spared his life. That's enough. I was sure she was going to stand up for me. The brave, beautiful Persephone was going to get me out of this. She shrugged indifferently. Fine. What's for breakfast? I'm starving. Cereal, Demeter said. Mother. The 2 women disappeared in a swirl of flowers and wheat. Don't feel too bad, Percy Jackson, Hades said. My ghosts keep me well informed of Kronos' plans. I can assure you that you had no chance to stop him in time. By tonight it will be too late for your precious Mount Olympus. The trap will be sprung. What trap? I demanded. If you know about it, do something. At least let me tell the other gods. Hades smiled. You are spirited. I'll give you credit for that. Have fun in my dungeon. We'll check on you again in, 50 or 60 years.